The morning of July 28th, 1914, broke grey and heavy over the industrial city of Newcastle upon Tyne in northeast England. The air smelled of coal smoke, wet iron, and the salt of the nearby North Sea. Along the River Tyne, the shipyards of Armstrong Whitworth were alive, with the clamour of thousands of hammers ringing against steel. This was the forge of empires, the place where the greatest weapons of the 20th century were hammered into existence. The sound was deafening, a symphony of industrial might that announced Britain's dominance over the world's oceans. Every rivet driven, every steel plate welded was a declaration of power. But on this specific Tuesday, the attention of every worker, every engineer, and every passerby was fixed on a single massive silhouette dominating the skyline. Resting in the dark water of the fitting-out basin was a Leviathan. It was the battleship Sultan Osman I. To call it a ship seemed inadequate. It was a floating steel fortress, a cathedral of war. It stretched nearly 700 feet from bow to stern, longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. It was painted in the slate-gray livery of a modern dreadnought, designed to disappear into the mist of battle. The ship's massive hull displaced over 27,000 tons of water. Its superstructure rose like a steel mountain crowned with observation platforms and fire control directors. But its most terrifying feature was its teeth. Rising from its deck were 7 massive gun turrets housing 14 12-inch cannons. No battleship in history had ever carried so many heavy guns. It was designed to unleash a broadside of nearly 7 tons of high explosive shells in a single volley, enough to vaporize a city block or break the back of any enemy vessel afloat. The ship represented the pinnacle of naval architecture, a weapon so powerful that it could single-handedly alter the balance of power in an entire region. Standing on the dockside in the shadow of this steel mountain were 500 men who looked very different from the pale workmen of Newcastle. They wore red fezes with black tassels. Their faces were bronzed by the Mediterranean sun. They spoke in the melodic cadences of Turkish and Arabic. They were the elite sailors of the Ottoman Navy, the chosen sons of an empire that stretched from the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia. They had traveled 3,000 miles to claim the ship. For months they had lived on a transport vessel docked nearby, waiting for this moment. The conditions had been cramped and uncomfortable, but their spirits remained high. They had spent their days learning the complex hydraulics of the gun turrets, mastering the intricacies of the steam turbines that would drive the propellers at speeds approaching 21 knots. They had spent their nights praying towards Mecca on the cold English decks, dreaming of the moment they would sail this weapon home to Istanbul. They wrote letters home describing the magnificent ship, speaking of it with reverence and pride. For these men, the Sultan Osman was not just a machine. It was a savior. It was the physical embodiment of their nation's hope, a steel promise that the humiliations of the past would never be repeated. They knew that back home, millions of people were waiting for them. They knew that the Golden Horn was decorated with flags, that children lined the streets of Istanbul rehearsing songs of welcome. They knew that the Sultan himself was preparing to welcome them with a ceremony that would be remembered for generations. They were scheduled to cast off in exactly 5 days. The coal bunkers were full, packed with thousands of tons of Welsh coal. The ammunition magazines were loaded with shells that had been carefully inspected and stowed. The Turkish flag was folded and ready to be raised over the stern in a moment of national triumph. But they did not know that 300 miles south, in a high-ceilinged office in Whitehall, London, a decision was being made that would shatter their dreams and set the world on fire. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, sat at his large mahogany desk staring at a map of the North Sea. The map was covered with pins and pencil marks showing the positions of fleets and the locations of naval bases. At 39 years old, Churchill was the youngest man to hold the post in modern times. He was brilliant, energetic, and arrogant, a man who believed that audacity and willpower could overcome any obstacle. He smoked a large cigar, the blue smoke drifting over the piles of urgent telegrams that littered his desk. Each telegram brought worse news than the last. The news from Europe was catastrophic. The continent was sliding toward the abyss. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, exactly 1 month earlier, had triggered a diplomatic landslide that was now becoming an avalanche. Austria-Hungary was crushing Serbia. Russia was mobilizing its massive steamroller army to defend the Serbs. Germany, the master of the continent, was preparing to strike at France through neutral Belgium in accordance with the Schlieffen Plan. Churchill's mind, however, was focused on the water. He knew that if war came, and it was now a matter of when, not if, Britain's survival would depend entirely on the Royal Navy. The island nation imported most of its food. If the sea lanes were cut, Britain would starve. The Grand Fleet had to be able to crush the German High Seas Fleet and maintain the blockade that would strangle Germany's economy. He began to do the math in his head. He counted the British dreadnoughts, 22 capital ships. He counted the German dreadnoughts, 15 capital ships, with more under construction. The margin of superiority was dangerously thin. If the Germans got lucky, if a few British ships hit mines or were torpedoed by submarines in the opening days of the war, the balance could shift. Britain could lose the war in an afternoon. A single decisive fleet action could determine the fate of the empire and the world. His eyes kept drifting back to the list of foreign warships being built in British yards. And there, glaring at him, were the names of two ships, the Sultan Osman I and the Rishadi, two super dreadnoughts, the most powerful ships of their generation. And they belonged to the Ottoman Empire, a power whose loyalty was uncertain. Churchill faced a nightmare scenario. The Ottoman Empire was technically neutral, but everyone who understood the geopolitics of the region knew that German influence in Istanbul was growing day by day. The Germans had been cultivating relationships with the Young Turks for years. German officers were training the Ottoman army. German engineers were building the Berlin-Baghdad railway. What if the Turks sailed these ships home and then, within weeks or months, joined the Germans in the war? What if the finest battleships built by British hands were used to sink British ships in the Mediterranean, to shell British bases in Egypt, to threaten the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the empire? It was a risk Churchill was not willing to take. He turned to the First Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, and made a statement that would echo through history. He said, "We cannot afford to have these ships used against us." The legal implications were irrelevant to him. The moral implications were secondary. The fact that the Ottoman government had already paid for the ships in full, that every penny had been transferred to British banks, was a mere detail in the calculus of empire. Churchill decided to steal them. To understand the sheer magnitude of this betrayal, we have to peel back the layers of history and look at the dying Ottoman Empire. By 1914, the empire was known throughout Europe as the sick man of Europe, a phrase coined decades earlier by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. It was a tragedy of slow collapse, a funeral procession that had been going on for 2 centuries. For 200 years, the Russians, the British, the French, and the Austrians had been tearing chunks off the Ottoman map like vultures picking at a carcass. They had lost Greece to revolution and British intervention. They had lost Serbia to nationalism. They had lost Bulgaria to Russian expansionism. They had lost Egypt to British occupation, though it remained nominally Ottoman until 1914. But the final humiliation came in 1912 during the Balkan Wars. A coalition of small Balkan states, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro, attacked the empire in what they called a war of liberation, but what was really a land grab. It was a disaster of epic proportions. The Ottoman armies, poorly equipped and badly led, were routed. Refugees flooded into Istanbul by the hundreds of thousands, bringing stories of massacre and defeat. But the worst blow came from the sea. The Greek navy, which was tiny compared to the Ottoman fleet on paper, had purchased a single modern armored cruiser from Italy named the Georgios Avarov. The Avarov was a revelation of modern naval warfare. It was faster and had better guns than anything the Turks possessed. It could stand off at long range and pound the Ottoman ships without being hit in return. In 2 decisive battles, the Battle of Ely and the Battle of Lemnos, the Avarov single-handedly terrorized the Ottoman navy. It blocked the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connected the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara and Istanbul beyond. It stopped the Ottomans from moving troops by sea, effectively cutting off the European provinces from reinforcement. The entire Ottoman fleet was bottled up in the straits, afraid to come out. It was a national humiliation of the highest order. The Turkish people watched from the hills of Istanbul as their rusting ironclads, relics of an earlier era, retreated from a single Greek ship. The psychological impact was devastating. After the war, the new government of the Young Turks, led by the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, vowed that this would never happen again. These were modernizers, nationalists who wanted to drag the empire into the 20th century. They realized that in the modern geopolitical arena, sovereignty was defined by dreadnoughts. Naval power determined who controlled the seas, who could project power, who would be taken seriously at the diplomatic table. If they wanted to hold on to their remaining islands in the Aegean, if they wanted to protect their coastline from Greek expansion, if they wanted to prevent further humiliation, they needed ships that could crush the Avarov and anything else the Greeks might acquire. But the Ottoman treasury was empty. The empire was drowning in debt accumulated from decades of war and mismanagement. The European powers controlled their finances through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an international organization that collected taxes on behalf of foreign creditors. How could a bankrupt nation afford the most expensive weapons on earth? A single dreadnought cost as much as the entire annual budget of a small province. The answer was the Navy League. The government launched a campaign that was part fundraising drive and part religious revival. They appealed directly to the patriotism and religious sentiment of the common people. They turned the acquisition of these battleships into a holy cause. It was not just about military strategy. It was about restoring the honor of Islam in the Turkish nation. It was framed as a sacred duty, a defense of the faith against Christian powers that sought to dismember the last great Muslim empire. The scenes that played out across the empire were extraordinary and deeply moving. In the Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, merchants set up collection boxes next to their stalls, decorated with images of battleships and Ottoman flags. In the remote villages of Anatolia, peasants who had never seen the sea and could barely afford to feed their families walked for days to the nearest town to donate a bag of grain or a single sheep to the cause. Imams in the mosques preached sermons declaring that every lira given to the Navy League was a bullet fired in defense of the faithful, a nail in the hull of a ship that would protect Muslim lands. Women played a central role in this campaign. In a society that was traditional and conservative, where women typically remained in domestic spheres, women stepped forward in unprecedented ways. They organized charity bazaars, selling handicrafts and sweets. They donated their jewelry, their most precious possessions. There are documented accounts of women taking the gold bracelets from their wrists, the dowries that were their only financial security in a patriarchal society, and dropping them into the Navy League's velvet bags. There were stories of schoolgirls cutting off their long hair to sell to wig makers in Europe, donating the pennies they received. Old women gave their wedding rings. The campaign became a national obsession, a collective act of sacrifice that united people across class and ethnic lines. The government issued a series of medals and ribbons to recognize donors. If you donated a small amount, you received a ribbon. If you donated a significant amount, you received a bronze medal called the Donanma Madalyasi, the Navy Medal. There were silver and gold medals for the wealthy merchants and landowners. It became a badge of honor to wear these medals in the street. If you walked into a coffee house without a Navy League ribbon on your lapel, you were looked at with suspicion, as if you were a traitor or a miser. It was a total mobilization of national wealth, an act of collective will that demonstrated the depth of Ottoman patriotism. With this river of gold flowing into Istanbul, the government went shopping. They went to Britain because, despite the political tensions and the centuries of rivalry, Britain was still seen as the gold standard of naval engineering. British shipyards had built the most advanced warships in the world. They placed the order for the Rashadia first, with the Vickers, Shipyard, and Barrow and Furness. It was a solid modern battleship, well-designed and formidable. But then a unique opportunity arose. The Armstrong Shipyard in Newcastle was building a monster ship for Brazil. It was named the Rio de Janeiro. The Brazilians had ordered it to win a naval arms race against Argentina and Chile, rival South American powers that were also buying dreadnoughts. But then the rubber boom collapsed and the Brazilian economy tanked. The price of rubber, which had made Brazil wealthy, crashed when British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia came online. The Brazilians couldn't afford the ship anymore. It was sitting on the stocks, half-finished, looking for a buyer, representing a massive financial loss for Armstrong Whitworth. The Ottoman government swooped in like a hawk spotting prey. They emptied the Navy League accounts. They took high-interest loans from French bankers who were eager to maintain Ottoman friendship. They bought the Rio de Janeiro and renamed it the Sultan Osman I, after the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. The specifications of the Sultan Osman were bizarre and terrifying. Because the Brazilians had wanted to impress the world and intimidate their neighbors, they had demanded the maximum number of guns, regardless of the practical implications. Most battleships had 8 or 10 heavy guns. The Sultan Osman had 14, an unprecedented armament. It was a glass cannon, lightly armored compared to British or German ships, but packing a punch that could annihilate anything afloat. The ship was a gamble, a bet that firepower could overcome protection. And so we returned to July 1914. The ships were paid for. The final installment of gold had been transferred to the Bank of England. Technically and legally, the Sultan Osman and the Rashadia were sovereign Ottoman territory, as much a part of the empire as the palace in Istanbul. But in Newcastle, the atmosphere was changing. Captain Rauf Bey, the commander of the Ottoman mission, began to sense a shift. Rauf Bey was a national hero, a dashing naval officer who had led daring raids during the Balkan Wars, sneaking small torpedo boats past enemy patrols. He was the perfect choice to captain the flagship. He had established a good relationship with the British engineers, learning their language and sharing meals with them. But in the last week of July, the British managers stopped looking him in the eye. Conversations became evasive. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Churchill had sent a secret order on July 29th. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obstruction. He told the shipbuilders to delay the departure by any means necessary, but do not be open about it. Be subtle. He told them to invent technical problems. Say the hydraulic pumps needed testing. Say the ammunition hoists were sticky. Say the coal bunkers needed to be restacked for proper weight distribution. Use any excuse, but do not let those ships leave. Rauf Bey was not a fool. He went to the shipyard daily, demanding answers with increasing frustration. He saw the ship. It was humming with life. Smoke was pouring from the funnels as the boilers were stoked. He saw provisions being loaded, crates of food, barrels of fresh water. But when he tried to walk up the gangway, the British foreman blocked his path with polite excuses and apologetic shrugs. Rauf Bey sent frantic, encrypted telegrams to Istanbul. The British are stalling. I fear they intend to seize the ships. He requested permission to board by force if necessary and break out of the harbor before it was too late. But the government in Istanbul, paralyzed by the unfolding crisis in Europe and fearful of provoking Britain, told him to wait. They believed that British honor would prevail. They could not believe that the country of the Magna Carta, the nation that prided itself on the rule of law, would commit such a brazen act of theft. On the morning of August 1st, 1914, the charade ended. Churchill had received intelligence that Germany was about to declare war on Russia. The Continental powers were mobilizing. Britain would likely be at war within days. He could wait no longer. He issued the order for requisition. A battalion of British infantry from the Sherwood Foresters Regiment marched down the cobblestone streets of Newcastle. They were in full combat gear, rifles slung over their shoulders, bayonets fixed. Local residents watched in confusion as the soldiers marched through the gates of the shipyard and took up positions around the dry dock. They set up the Maxim machine guns on tripods, pointing at the gangways of the Sultan Osman, ready to cut down anyone who resisted. Captain Ralph Bay arrived at the dock to find his ship surrounded by bayonets. A senior British officer, stiff and formal, approached him. He handed Ralph Bay a letter on official government stationery. It stated that His Majesty's government was exercising its right to preemptive requisition due to the national emergency. The Ottoman crews were ordered to collect their personal belongings and leave the area immediately. There would be no negotiation. The scene was one of crushing humiliation. The Turkish sailors, who had polished the brass and scrubbed the decks, who had learned the names of the British workmen and shared cigarettes with them, watched as the British bluejackets, the sailors of the Royal Navy, marched on board and took control of their stations. They watched British officers walk into the captain's cabin that Ralph Bay had prepared. The Ottoman flag, the red crescent and star, was lowered from the stern in a deliberate ceremony. The white ensign of the Royal Navy was raised in its place, snapping in the wind. Ralph Bay stood on the dock, his fists clenched, fighting back tears of rage. He was a warrior, a man trained to suppress emotion, but in this moment he felt the weight of national tragedy. He knew what this meant. It was not just the loss of a ship. It was a slap in the face of the entire Ottoman nation. It was a message from London that the Turks were not equals, that their property and their honor meant nothing compared to British interests. He gathered his men. They boarded the transport ship that would take them back to Istanbul, their faces masks of fury and sorrow. The journey home was a funeral procession. They were returning empty-handed. They had to face the millions of people who had given their gold. They had to tell the schoolgirls that their hair had been sold for nothing. They had to explain to the old women that their wedding rings had bought them betrayal. When the news hit Istanbul, the reaction was volcanic. It is hard for us today, living in a different world, to understand the intensity of the anger. It was not just a political dispute between governments. It was a personal robbery. Every man who had worn a Navy League medal felt like Churchill had reached into his pocket and stolen his money. The newspapers screamed for blood, running headlines that called for revenge. The posters of the Navy League, which had depicted the ships steaming to glory, were torn down or draped in black crepe as symbols of mourning. In the Dolmabahce Palace, the Ottoman cabinet was in turmoil. The government was divided. The Grand Vizier, Said Halim Pasha, was a moderate who wanted to maintain neutrality. He argued that the empire was too weak to fight, that entering the war would be suicide. He wanted to negotiate with Britain for compensation, to demand the return of the money at least. But the Minister of War, Enver Pasha, was a different breed of man. Enver was 32 years old, ambitious, ruthless, and a fervent admirer of Germany. He had served as a military attaché in Berlin and had been dazzled by German efficiency and military power. He wore a German-style mustache and spoke German fluently. He believed that Germany was the future and Britain was the past, a declining empire clinging to outdated notions of superiority. For months, Enver had been trying to push the empire into an alliance with Germany. But the other ministers had resisted. They respected Britain's naval power and feared British retaliation. But now Churchill had handed Enver the perfect weapon, a rallying cry. Enver stood up in the cabinet meeting and slammed his fist on the table. "Look at what the British have done," he shouted. "They treat us like slaves. They steal our ships. They spit on our honor. How can we trust them? The Germans treat us like warriors. They offer us an alliance of equals." And indeed, the Germans were quick to capitalize on the crisis. The Kaiser in Berlin saw the opportunity immediately. He knew the Ottomans were furious. He knew they felt defenseless without their fleet. He realized that if he could solve their naval problem, he could win them over and open a new front against Russia. Germany had a naval squadron in the Mediterranean commanded by Admiral Wilhelm Souchon. It consisted of the battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau. The Goeben was a magnificent ship, not as powerful as the Sultan Osman, but faster and battle-hardened. It had already seen action in the Adriatic and had earned a reputation for speed and aggression. On August 3rd, as the war was erupting across Europe with Germany invading Belgium and Britain issuing ultimatums, the German High Command sent a secret radio message to Admiral Souchon. "Proceed to Constantinople. This order set in motion one of the most dramatic naval chases in history. Souchon was in the western Mediterranean near Algeria, having just bombarded French ports. To get to Istanbul, he had to sail nearly 1,000 miles east, right through the heart of British naval dominance. Hunting him was the British Mediterranean fleet, led by Admiral Archibald Berkeley Milne, a cautious officer who had risen through the ranks through connections rather than brilliance. Milne had a massive force: 3 battle cruisers, 4 armored cruisers, and 4 light cruisers. He outnumbered Souchon 10-1. It should have been an easy kill. The British ships were faster and had more guns. It should have been a matter of hours, but Souchon was a sailor of immense skill and determination, and he had one advantage: desperation. He knew he couldn't go home. The British controlled the Strait of Gibraltar. He couldn't go into the Atlantic. His only hope was the Dardanelles. He ordered his ships to run at full speed. The engines of the Goeben were plagued by boiler tube failures. The coal was bad, low-quality stuff that produced more smoke than heat. But Souchon drove his men relentlessly. Inside the boiler rooms, the heat rose to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Stokers fainted from exhaustion and heat stroke. German officers stood with pistols drawn, not to shoot the enemy, but to ensure the men kept shoveling coal into the furnaces. It was a race against time and fuel. The British fumbled the chase in a series of errors that would haunt Milne for the rest of his life. Admiral Milne was cautious. He was worried about protecting the French troop transports crossing from Africa to France. He received confusing orders from Churchill in London. He hesitated when he should have attacked. Souchon slipped through the net. He engaged in a running battle with British light cruisers, but his heavy guns kept them at bay. He reached the Aegean Sea running on fumes. His coal bunkers were practically empty. He had to stop at a Greek island to buy coal from a merchant ship, violating neutrality laws, but he didn't care. Survival was all that mattered. On the afternoon of August 10th, 1914, the Goeben and the Breslau arrived at the mouth of the Dardanelles. The entrance to the straits was guarded by massive Ottoman forts with rows of heavy guns and rows of naval mines blocking the channel. Souchon stopped his ships. He radioed the Turkish commander at the fort. "I request permission to enter." This was the moment that would decide the fate of the Middle East. Enver Pasha was in the War Ministry when the message arrived. "The German ships are at the gate. The British fleet is close behind them. If we let them in, we are violating neutrality. If we keep them out, the British will sink them." The Grand Vizier hesitated. He knew that letting them in was effectively an act of war against Britain, even if not officially declared. But Enver Pasha didn't wait for consensus. He acted on his own authority, seizing the moment. He sent a message to the forts: "Open the minefields, let them in." As the boom nets parted and the gray shapes of the German warships glided into the calm waters of the straits, the British vanguard appeared on the horizon. They were just hours too late. The door had slammed shut. But now a diplomatic crisis erupted. The British ambassador in Istanbul, Sir Lewis Mallet, stormed into the Grand Vizier's office. He demanded that the German ships be interned. Under international law, a neutral country must arrest the crew and disable the weapons of any belligerent warship that enters its ports. The Ottomans were trapped. They couldn't arrest the Germans because Enver wouldn't allow it, but they couldn't admit they were sheltering them without declaring war, which they weren't ready to do. Then someone, perhaps a German diplomat, perhaps a Turkish minister, came up with a stroke of genius. A lie so bold that it changed reality. The Ottoman government released an official statement. They said, "We have not sheltered these ships. We have bought them. The German government has kindly agreed to sell us the Goeben and the Breslau to replace the 2 ships that the British stole from us." It was pure theater. No money changed hands. The ships were still German property in every legal sense, but the propaganda value was immense. The Turkish people, who had been in mourning for their lost ships, suddenly went wild with joy. The British stole our ships, so the Germans gave us new ones. It was poetic justice, a reversal of fortune. On August 16th, a ceremony was held in the Golden Horn that was surreal even by the standards of the war. The German naval ensign was lowered from the stern of the Goeben. The Ottoman flag, with the crescent and star, was raised. The ship was renamed the Yavuz Sultan Selim, after one of the most feared Ottoman sultans. The Breslau was renamed the Midilli, but there was a problem. The Ottomans didn't have any sailors trained to operate these complex German turbines and fire control systems, so the German crews didn't leave. Instead, crates of uniforms were brought on board. The German sailors, blonde-haired, blue-eyed men from Hamburg and Kiel, took off their Kriegsmarine uniforms and put on Ottoman uniforms. They put on fezes. Admiral Souchon, the German aristocrat, put on a fez and was appointed commander-in-chief of the Ottoman Navy. The British ambassador watched this masquerade with fury. He knew they were still German ships. He knew the orders were still coming from Berlin. But the diplomatic fiction held. Britain was not yet ready to fight the Turks, not while the battle was still raging on the Western Front. For 2 months, the Yavuz sat in the harbor, a loaded gun pointed at the heart of Russia, the peace held by a thread. The moderate ministers in the Ottoman government tried desperately to keep the empire neutral. They argued that they had their ships now, so they could stay out of the war. But Enver Pasha and Admiral Souchon had other plans. They had secret orders from the Kaiser. Bring Turkey into the war. Open a new front to distract the Russians and the British. Souchon grew impatient. He was tired of sitting at anchor. He was a warrior, not a diplomat. He wanted to fight. In late October, he went to Enver. They hatched a plot to force the government's hand to create a crisis that would make neutrality impossible. On October 27th, Admiral Souchon took his fleet, the Yavuz, the Midilli, and a squadron of Turkish destroyers, into the Black Sea. He announced he was going on a training maneuver, a routine exercise. He steamed north into the cold, gray waters toward the Russian coast. He ordered radio silence to be broken only by battle commands. On the morning of October 29th, 1914, the citizens of the Russian port of Sevastopol woke up to a thunderous roar that shook windows and rattled dishes. They looked out to sea and saw a massive battleship flying the Turkish flag, firing heavy shells into the harbor. The Yavuz pounded the Russian naval base. Shells crashed into warehouses, docks, and ships. Simultaneously, the Midilli shelled the port of Novorossiysk, sinking 14 transport ships and setting the massive oil storage tanks on fire. The smoke from the burning oil turned the day into night, a black cloud that could be seen for 50 miles. It was a sneak attack, a Pearl Harbor of the Black Sea. Souchon had done it. He had committed an act of war so flagrant, so brutal, that there was no going back. When the news reached Istanbul, the moderate ministers were horrified. They tried to draft an apology to the Ghazar. They tried to claim that Souchon had gone rogue, acting without orders. But the Russians were not interested in apologies. They had been attacked by Turkish ships flying Turkish flags. On November 2nd, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. On November 5th, Britain and France declared war. The sick man of Europe had thrown away his crutches and picked up a gun. The Middle East was at war, and it all started because Winston Churchill wanted to save 2 ships. The Black Sea raid was the point of no return. As the Russian oil tanks burned in Novorossiysk, the fires of war began to consume the Middle East. In London, Winston Churchill received the news with a grim determination. His nightmare had come true. The Ottoman Empire had joined the Central Powers. The Dardanelles were closed, cutting off the vital supply line to Russia. The Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the British Empire, was now within striking distance of the Turkish armies. Churchill, the man who prided himself on his strategic vision, felt the weight of his own decision pressing down on him. He had stolen the Sultan Osman to protect the Royal Navy, but in doing so, he had handed the enemy a strategic victory far greater than the value of 2 battleships. He needed to fix it. He needed a knockout blow that would vindicate his decision. His eyes turned to the map of the Dardanelles, that narrow, winding strait that separated Europe from Asia and led directly to Istanbul. Churchill conceived a plan that was audacious, daring, and ultimately doomed. He believed that the Royal Navy was invincible. He believed that if he sent a massive fleet of battleships to force the straits, they could blast the Ottoman forts into dust, sail up to the Golden Horn, and aim their guns at the Sultan's palace. The Ottoman government, he believed, would panic and surrender. The sick man would die of fright. It was a plan born of arrogance. It ignored the lessons of history. It ignored the fact that ships fighting forts almost always lose. Forts have stable gun platforms. They can't sink. But Churchill was convinced. In February 1915, a colossal armada gathered in the Aegean Sea. It included the most powerful ships in the British and French navies. And in a twist of irony that would make a Greek tragedian weep, one of the ships in the fleet was the HMS Agincourt. The Agincourt was the renamed Sultan Osman I, the very ship that had been stolen. It was now sailing to attack the people who had paid for it. The Turkish gunners in the forts, looking through their binoculars, would have recognized its silhouette. They knew the number of its guns. They knew the shape of its turrets. Seeing their own stolen property bearing down on them, flying the enemy flag, filled them with a cold, resolute fury. They were not just defending their capital, they were fighting a personal vendetta. The naval attack began on February 19th. The British ships unleashed a storm of steel. The noise was deafening, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard in Istanbul 40 miles away. The Agincourt, with its 14 12-inch guns, fired full broadsides that shook the sea itself. The Ottoman forts crumbled under the impact. Stone walls built centuries ago disintegrated. But the Ottomans had a secret weapon. It was not a battleship. It was a small, insignificant mine layer named the Nusret. While the British armada was pounding the outer forts, the Nusret had slipped out silently at night. Its captain, a young officer with keen tactical instincts, had noticed a pattern. The British ships would steam up the straits, fire their guns, and then turn starboard into Erinköy Bay to retreat and let the next wave of ships come in. The Nusret laid a line of 26 naval mines, not across the channel as was standard, but parallel to the shore, right in the maneuvering area of the British fleet. On March 18, 1915, the British launched their main attack. 18 battleships steamed into the straits in 3 waves. They silenced the forts. Admiral de Robeck, the British commander, thought he had won. Victory seemed within reach. He ordered the French squadron to turn back and the British reserve squadron to move forward. The French battleship Bouvet turned into Erinkuy Bay. At 1:54 p.m., a massive explosion ripped the ocean apart. A column of water and flame shot hundreds of feet into the air. The Bouvet had struck one of the Nusret's mines. The ship broke in half. In less than 2 minutes, it capsized and vanished beneath the waves, taking 600 French sailors with it. The British thought it was a torpedo or a lucky shell from the forts. They didn't realize they were drifting into a minefield. Minutes later, the British battleship HMS Irresistible struck a mine. A huge hole was blown in its hull. Then HMS Ocean struck a mine. The battlecruiser HMS Inflexible struck a mine and began to list heavily, water pouring into its compartments. Panic seized the fleet. In a single afternoon, the Allies had lost 3 capital ships and had 3 more crippled. A third of the fleet was out of action. The mighty Royal Navy, which had ruled the waves for a century, had been defeated by a tiny mine layer and the hubris of its commanders. Churchill was devastated. The naval attack was called off, but the Allies could not walk away. Too much prestige was at stake. They decided that if ships couldn't do it, soldiers would have to. This led to the land invasion of Gallipoli. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops, British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and Indian, stormed the beaches. They expected to march to Istanbul in a week. Instead, they found themselves pinned down on narrow strips of sand and rock, exposed to murderous fire from the heights above. The Ottoman soldiers, led by Mustafa Kemal, fought with the desperation of men defending their last home. They held the high ground. For 8 months, the campaign became a meat grinder. It was trench warfare in the heat of the Mediterranean summer. Dysentery and flies killed as many men as bullets. Bodies rotted in no man's land. By the time the Allies evacuated in defeat in January 1916, over 500,000 men were dead or wounded. The beaches were graveyards. The dream of a quick victory had turned into a nightmare. Winston Churchill was the political casualty. He was forced to resign as First Lord of the Admiralty. He was scapegoated for the disaster. He left London in disgrace and went to serve as a battalion commander in the trenches of the Western Front, trying to wash away the stain of Gallipoli and the mud of Flanders. The ghost of the stolen ships haunted him for years, but the war continued. The Sultan Osman, now the Agincourt, survived the Dardanelles. It was sent north to join the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. On May 31st, 1916, the Agincourt sailed out to meet the German High Seas Fleet at the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval clash in history. Over 200 ships engaged in a massive fleet action in the cold waters of the North Sea. The Agincourt was a strange beast in the British line. The British sailors called it the Gin Palace because its fittings were luxurious, meant for Ottoman officers. The captain's quarters had ornate woodwork, but in battle it was a monster. During the night action at Jutland, the Agincourt found itself close to the German battle line. The captain gave the order to open fire. The Agincourt did something that no other ship had ever done. It fired all 14 of its 12-inch guns at once, a full broadside. The flash was so bright that observers on other ships thought the Agincourt had blown up. The recoil was so violent that it shattered the crockery in the galley and stripped the paint off the deck. But the ship held together. It hurled 7 tons of steel at the Germans in seconds. It was a terrifying display of the power that the Ottomans had sought to possess. But tactical victories at sea could not save the Ottoman Empire on land. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The war dragged on for 4 brutal years. The British blockade starved the Ottoman cities. Food became scarce. Inflation soared. The Arab revolt, fueled by British gold and promises of independence, tore away the southern provinces. T.E. Lawrence, the famed Lawrence of Arabia, rallied Arab tribes against Ottoman rule. Jerusalem fell to General Allenby in December 1917. Baghdad fell. Damascus fell. The empire was collapsing from within and without. By 1918, the Ottoman armies were exhausted. The empire was bankrupt. On October 30th, 1918, aboard the British battleship HMS Agamemnon anchored off the island of Lemnos. The Ottoman delegation signed the Armistice of Mudros. It was an unconditional surrender. 13 days later, on November the 13th, 1918, the final scene of this tragedy played out. An Allied fleet of 60 ships sailed through the Dardanelles. The minefields had been swept. The forts were silent, their guns spiked and abandoned. They steamed past the graves of the men who had died at Gallipoli. They entered the Sea of Marmara and dropped anchor in the Golden Horn, directly in front of the Dolmabahce Palace and the Hagia Sophia. It was the first time since 1453, since the fall of Constantinople to Mehmed the Conqueror, that a foreign fleet had occupied Constantinople. And there, in the middle of the fleet, flying the Union Jack, was the HMS Agincourt. The ship had finally come home, but it had come as an executioner. For the people of Istanbul watching from the hills, the sight was heartbreaking. They remembered the gold bracelets. They remembered the children's hair. They saw their own ship, the vessel that was supposed to save them, now acting as the flagship of the occupation. It was a symbol of total defeat. The aftermath of the war reshaped the world map. The Treaty of Sèvres partitioned the Ottoman Empire like a carcass. The British and French diplomats, Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, had already drawn lines on the map, carving up the Middle East into zones of influence with barely a thought for the people who lived there. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. The borders were drawn with a ruler, paying no attention to the ethnic or religious realities on the ground. The Kurds were left without a state, divided among Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The Arabs, who had been promised independence by Britain in exchange for their revolt, were given colonial mandates instead. The seeds of every major conflict in the modern Middle East, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the rise of ISIS, were sown in the wreckage of the Ottoman collapse. And what of the ships themselves? The HMS Agincourt, despite its impressive performance at Jutland, was never loved by the Royal Navy. It was considered a structural freak. It was too long, too difficult to maneuver. After the war, in 1921, the British government decided to scrap it. The ship that had caused a world war, the ship that had cost millions in gold and blood, was towed to a breaker's yard in Scotland. It was cut apart by acetylene torches. Its mighty guns were melted down. Its steel was recycled into razor blades, cars, and bridges. The Rashadi, renamed HMS Arran, suffered the same fate. Scrapped in 1921. 2 super dreadnoughts reduced to scrap metal. But the Goeben, the German ship that had started the war, survived. Renamed the Yavuz, it became the flagship of the new Turkish Navy. It served the new Turkish Republic founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the hero of Gallipoli who transformed Turkey into a modern nation. When Ataturk died in 1938, his body was carried on the deck of the Yavuz in a final salute. It remained in service until the 1950s, the last surviving battlecruiser of the Great War. It was finally scrapped in 1973, a lingering ghost of the imperial age. As we look back at this story a century later, the question remains, was it worth it? Winston Churchill believed he did the right thing. He secured the naval balance in the North Sea. He ensured that the Royal Navy had the margin of victory. From a purely British naval perspective, the seizure was a success. The Agincourt fought at Jutland and contributed to British naval supremacy. But the geopolitical cost was incalculable. If Churchill had allowed the ships to sail, the Ottoman Empire might have remained neutral. The pro-British faction in the government would have been strengthened. The Dardanelles would have remained open, allowing supplies to reach Russia. Russia might have been stronger, better equipped to withstand the German offensives. Without the Ottoman entry into the war, the entire character of the conflict would have changed. The war would have been shorter. Millions of lives might have been saved. The Russian Revolution might have been averted or delayed, changing the entire course of the 20th century. The map of the Middle East would look completely different today. There might have been no Iraq, no Syria, no Palestine mandate, and therefore no Israeli-Palestinian conflict as we know it. The theft of the Sultan Osman was a tactical victory, but a strategic catastrophe. It demonstrated the blindness of imperial power. Churchill saw battleships as just machines, tools of war. He didn't see them as symbols. He didn't understand that by stealing a nation's pride, he was creating an enemy far more dangerous than any fleet. The legacy of that theft is written in the history books, but it is also written in the memory of the region. It reinforced a narrative of betrayal that persists to this day. The idea that the West speaks of law and justice but practices piracy when it suits its interests. This narrative has shaped Middle Eastern attitudes toward the West for generations. The day Winston Churchill stole the Ottoman Navy, he thought he was just seizing 2 hulls of steel. In reality, he was seizing the destiny of the Middle East and steering it toward a century of storm. The shipyards of Newcastle are quiet now. The great dreadnoughts are gone, reduced to memories and museum pieces. But the echoes of the guns of the Sultan Osman are still ringing in the world we live in today. Every conflict, every border dispute, every act of terrorism in the Middle East can trace its roots back in part to the decisions made in that gray morning in 1914 when a British politician decided that power mattered more than honor. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.